I'd like to look at a grading rubric for this question that is taken from an old AP exam. It says that a certain university, students who live in the dorms eat at a common dining hall. Recently, some students have been complaining, and so we're going to do a survey to see if students think we should have different food or better food. The question says, in this setting, explain how bias may have been introduced based on the way this convenient sample was selected, and suggest how the sample could have been selected differently to avoid that bias. So there's two things I've got to do. I've got to talk about how the sample was selected and why that was a problem, and suggest how to improve it. So here is the solution to that. Since the manager used a convenience sample, bias may have been introduced. Perhaps the students who arrive at the cafeteria early may have opinions of food quality that differ in some important way from other students who live in the dorm. That could be avoided by taking a random sample of 100 dorm residents instead of just asking the 100 students entering the cafeteria. Now, you notice in this answer, they identified the problem with the sampling method, and they talked about how to correct that method, or that problem. So here's the rubric for actually grading it. Now, you'll notice down in the bottom of the page, there's a place for your name. If you're the grader, put your name on there. And for each part, it says EP or I. What that means is, did you get it essentially correct, partly correct, or incorrect? For an essentially correct response here on part A, we've got to talk about how these students could introduce bias because the first 100 students may have opinions that aren't the same as everybody else. And you have to propose a reasonable alternative that involves random selection. Maybe it's a stratified sample or a systematic sample with some random starting point, maybe a simple random sample of dorm residents. So a reasonable alternative with random selection. If they've done both of those things, then circle E down there at the bottom. It's partially correct if the response says why those first 100 are not reasonable, but the alternative doesn't include a random selection. The easiest way to get to a random selection is to use the word random. If they didn't do that, it's highly likely that they're only going to get a partial. They'll also get a partial if they proposed a reasonable alternative that involves random selection, but didn't really say why the first 100 could introduce bias. So they need to address why these 100 students might have bias, because they could have opinions that are different than the rest of the students in the dorm. So they get an E or a P, and if you don't feel like they did either one of those, they get an I. This is a complete rubric, enough for you to make an educated decision on what you think they should get. Make that decision. Next, it said explain how the bias may have been introduced by the way the question was worded, and suggest how we could word it differently to avoid that bias. So here's a good solution. The way the question's worded may be misleading. The first part includes a statement that many students think it needs improvement. This may lead people to support the view by responding that the food does in fact need improvement. They also included the phrase, even though it would increase the cost of the meal plan. Well, that might lead students to say, nah, it's okay, I don't want to pay anymore. A better wording might be to simply ask, do you think the quality of food served in the cafeteria needs improvement? So you left out the beginning of some students think it does, and you left out the end of even if it costs more money. Now, just like before, we're going to grade part B on an E, P, or I scale. For an essentially correct response, they pointed out at least one of the two problems. Not necessarily both of them, but they talked about either the wording that a lot of students think it needs fixing, or the part that says it may cost more money. If they addressed either one of those and they propose a reasonable alternate wording that addresses that concern, then that's good. Note, it says the student only needs to identify one problem and fix it. If only one of the two concerns is raised, the alternate wording only needs to address that concern. However, if they identify both problems, the alternate wording must solve both problems. Part B is partly correct if you identify one or both of the potential wording problems, but you don't offer a new solution that fixes whatever you said the problem was. And it's incorrect. They note this. Now, before I didn't talk about incorrect. It was incorrect if you didn't do that. whatever the rubric was. But here they specifically said it is incorrect if you point out both wording problems and then you say, but that's okay because one makes you say yes and the other one makes you say no, so they balance out. It doesn't work that way. You can't do that. So make your decision off of this about whether they should get an E, a P, or an I. Circle that. Now that you've given them an E, a P, or an I, and most long answer questions are graded on that same concept, essentially correct, partly correct, incorrect. They will get a complete response if they get 2 E's. If they get an E and a P, they get a 3. If they get a P and an I, or 2 P's, they get a 2. If they get a P and an I, they get a 1. And if they get 2 I's, they get a 0. Now what I'd like you to do is give that to another person, not the person whose paper it is, have them read over it, y'all can trade, and see if they concur with your assessment. You do the same for them. If y'all disagree, come to an agreement based on that rubric. Once you both agree and you've both got your name on that paper, then you can return it to the owner and let them look at it.